Chris Jericho once called a legendary British wrestling referee the worst referee he'd ever worked with. Years later, I accidentally helped bring peace between them through a joke on Twitter, and honestly, it's one of the strangest stories I've ever been involved in. Before we get into this one, make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and follow me on Instagram at The Wrestling Comedian and over on TikTok at Wrestling Comedian. Hello everyone, I'm Josh Faulkner, the Wrestling Comedian, and this is the story of Mal Mason, Chris Jericho, and the weird little part I somehow played in burying the hatchet. Now, if you've read Chris Jericho's first autobiography, A Lion's Tale Around the World in Spandex, available in all good charity shops, you might remember a particular story involving a British wrestling referee, and that referee was the legendary Mal Mason. And before I go any further, I just want to make this clear. I have a huge amount of respect for Mal. He was always incredibly kind to me, very welcoming, very encouraging, and genuinely one of the warmest people in British wrestling. I first met Mal Mason when I was around 14 years old, and years later, especially when I started working for Brian Dixon's All-Star Wrestling in 2011, I got to spend a lot more time around him, travelling to shows, working camps, driving around the country, and honestly, if you were around British wrestling long enough, eventually you crossed paths with Mal Mason, because Mal was everywhere. He was refereeing, he was emceeing, he was helping promoters keep shows together. Mal Mason was one of those old school wrestling personalities who could walk into a building and instantly improve the atmosphere. And I'll never forget one piece of advice he gave me early on, at a time when I wasn't very confident showing out to audiences. Mal said to me, "Josh, you've got to treat the audience like it's a party, and you want to make those people feel welcome at your party." And honestly, that stayed with me, because that wasn't just wrestling advice. That's advice that I've also used in stand-up. Anyway, back to Chris Jericho. So Jericho tells this story in his book about wrestling on the German tournament scene in the early 1990s. And during one of those matches, Mal Mason is refereeing. Jericho hits the ropes, and apparently Mal suddenly does a drop down in front of him like he's joining the match, which forces Jericho to have to leap over the referee. Now, in fairness, that is objectively funny, but Jericho absolutely hated it. And in the book, he describes Mal rather harshly as a mark for himself. Now, naturally, Mal wasn't thrilled about this, and for years after the book's release, it became one of those funny little stories people in British wrestling knew about. In fact, Mal claimed he later cornered Jericho backstage at a WWE show and was told there'd be an apology in Jericho's follow-up autobiography. Only the next book came out, and there was no apology. So this became an ongoing joke around Mal for years. And because Mal had a good sense of humour about things, people would tease him about it constantly, including me. I remember wrestling once on a show under a mask gimmick, and in my pre-match promo, I said something along the lines of, "First of all, before I get started, I'd just like to say, my good buddy Chris Jericho was right about you all along. You are the worst human being I have met, but I've not even met my opponent yet. And now I've done with you." And Mal immediately flipped me the bird, which honestly was peak Mal Mason. He could take a joke, give one back, and still make everyone laugh. Now, fast forward to 2019, and this is before the Wrestling Comedian properly existed in the way people know it now. At the time, I'd started doing comedy wrestling commentary on Twitter, basically reacting to wrestling stories with tongue-in-cheek jokes. And there'd been an angle, or maybe it was a real incident, I genuinely don't know, and this involved Josh Bodom attacking a referee on a Rev Pro show. Rev Pro tweeted that Bodom had been suspended, so I quote tweeted it with, "Head of the British Wrestling's Referee Alliance, Mal Mason, has demanded an apology from Josh Bodom. P.S. He's also awaiting one from you, Chris Jericho," and I tagged Chris Jericho. Now, honestly, I expected about 3 likes and maybe one wrestler replying with laughing emojis. Instead, minutes later, my phone absolutely exploded because Chris Jericho had replied, and he wrote, "I'm sorry, I would never mess with Mal." And suddenly, this stupid little joke tweet went everywhere in the wrestling community. People were screenshotting it, there were Reddit threads, wrestling fans were sharing it around. And the funniest part? Mal Mason absolutely loved it. I remember his son posting on Facebook saying his dad was made up over it. And honestly, after all those years, that tiny little interaction genuinely felt like the hatchet had been buried. Through comedy, which somehow feels very fitting. And sadly, not too long after that, Mal Mason passed away in late 2020, and British wrestling genuinely lost somebody important. Because Mal wasn't just a referee, he was one of those glue people in wrestling, the sort of person who brought people together, who kept morale up, who'd welcomed younger wrestlers, who remembered everybody. I was lucky enough to have Mal on my podcast during COVID called Doing the Round, which I really need to find those files again because the stories he told were brilliant. Then, in January 2021, under all the COVID restrictions, I attended Mal's funeral, and honestly, I mainly went because I wanted to say thank you. Thank you for being welcoming, thank you for being kind, and thank you for treating me well when I was young and inexperienced in wrestling. Because not everybody does that in this industry. And I think sometimes people underestimate how important that kindness is, especially to younger wrestlers trying to find confidence. So, no, I didn't exactly broker world peace between Chris Jericho and Mal Mason, but through one silly little joke tweet, I like to think I played a tiny little part in finally getting Mal the apology he'd waited years for. So if you've got any memories of Mal Mason, leave them in the comments. And if you want more stories from British wrestling, comedy, and the madness of life around the business, you know what to do. And remember, I'll see you on the next one.